Smoke crawled along the Liffey as if the tide had learned to burn. Easter Monday was meant for parades and sermons, for clean coats and family dinners. Instead, a column of volunteers marched up Sackville Street at noon and halted at the steps of the General Post Office. Trams clanged and clanged because the drivers refused to admit that the city had changed shape. Padraig Pearse unfolded a paper and read words that felt taller than the building behind him. The flag of the Irish Republic climbed the facade. James Connolly limped the length of the hall, posting sentries and carrying a nation in his set jaw. Sandbags went to the windows. Loops of wire appeared at corners where cavalry might imagine itself bold. Shoppers stopped, laughed, and then stopped laughing. The posts fell in a pattern that had been walked in secret for months. Boland's Mill and the railway approaches. The Four Courts and its stone weight. The South Dublin Union with its maze of wards and stairwells. At St. Stephen's Green, Countess Markiewicz's citizen army dug tidy trenches that made military sense until the British took the windows of the college across the street and fired down as if at targets on a range. Boys who had never left Dublin suddenly lived in a war made of streets, where roofs were ground and alleys were rivers, and every second window could sprout a muzzle. Messages were written by clerks, folded like soldiers' orders, and run by girls and boys who learned the music of bullets in an afternoon. The first British columns came on with a bravado borrowed from other wars. Officers blew whistles because that was what officers did. Men advanced because habit is stronger than fear until the first sheet of fire tears the habit away. Trinity College posted machine guns. The gunboat Helga slid up the river and made a cannon out of water, its shells slapping the air so flat that ears rang in inland lanes. One shell punched into a warehouse, another gouged the GPO's stone. Each blow felt like the city being told to sit down. The windows of the post office answered in tidy bursts, and Dublin learned the difference between echo and incoming. The first night was a confusion of small battles and bigger decisions. A porter tried to carry a crate through a street that had lost its name and found himself under fire. A child clutched an Easter egg while his mother negotiated a doorway, and the wind from the Helga slapped grit against their faces. Looters hauled hats and bolts of linen into alleys, and then tossed them away when troops rounded the corner and the future looked short. Some houses took families down to the cellars with buckets and prayer books. Others opened doors to bleeding strangers and accepted the risk without conversation. Tuesday gave the rising the weight it would have in memory. The Helga settled its ranges. The GPO's roof timbers smoldered. Telegraphists clacked out orders while scorched plaster dusted their shoulders. Connolly, wounded in the ankle, spoke curses that sounded like blessings and kept ammunition moving. Pearse walked the rooms with the reserve of a man who had already met his fate and had shaken its hand. Volunteers darted through lanes with messages in their pockets and fire on their sleeves. Outside, Sackville Street began to burn at the edges, a slow fuse that grew brighter as the day narrowed. Mount Street Bridge turned into a toll gate paid in men. A handful of riflemen held a nest of houses and sightlines, while waves of troops tried to push through. Kingstown's battalions met cones of fire that shaved ranks thin, then thinner. The water under the bridge kept moving because water always does. Stretcher parties stepped like dancers around bodies and rifle pits and carried breathers and the dead without sorting them until later. In the South, at the Union, nuns walked between wards as if the air were not a map of danger, their hands steady while students with rifles learned how to survive corners. Wednesday brought a heat no April had any right to own. The GPO spat smoke from every joint. Volunteers beat stair fires with coats and swore, then gave the stairs to flame and used ladders instead. At the Four Courts, files and forms and the furniture of law became barricades, then piles of kindling. In streets where shop signs still hung askew, Ordinary people made quiet choices that belonged to soldiers. Dash for water and risk the alley, or let a neighbor's house go. Pull a wounded man in, or bolt the door and pretend you did not hear his breath. Civilians died in numbers that would be tallied later in rooms that smelled of ink and fatigue. Food became rumor and water a prize. Women carried jugs like diplomats under flag. Boys in aprons borrowed the language of orderlies and went door to door with kettles. Priests stumbled through dust with oils and linen. Doctors rifled haberdashers for needles. Somewhere a baby was born to the sound of rifle volleys. Somewhere a spinster famed for talk turned silent and stitched wounds without comment. On the city's edge, curious people walked to the fields and watched the skyline as if a quarrelsome god were setting off fireworks. By Thursday, the GPO was a kiln. The roof caught and fell through in hot sheets. Connolly lay on a table and kept command as if Payne were a clerk to be told what to do. Pierce understood that mathematics had collapsed. For every British casualty, a dozen fresh soldiers came ashore. For every barricade thrown up, there was a new angle for a field gun. Staying meant dying in a building that had taught an empire how to deliver letters. Leaving meant trying to carry the wounded across streets that snapped and hissed. They broke out under a cowl of smoke and stumbled to Moore Street, into rooms that smelled of meat and sawdust. Butcher's hooks swung like punctuation on a sentence that had not decided its ending yet. There, among carcasses and ledgers, Pierce drafted surrender to spare civilians more shelling. Elizabeth O'Farrell took the paper and stepped into a street so gray the white flag barely showed. She walked toward the British lines with a calm that people would remember when they forgot almost everything else. Orders moved back through alleys in the hands of nurses, whose names would vanish into parish ledgers, and then return each spring when the city's blossoms opened and the old men talked. Saturday's silence arrived with the stubbornness of a chair after a long day. Prisoners were marched through crowds that hissed and spat. The anger was ordinary and deep. Lost wages, dear bread, ruins where houses had been, loved ones under sheets. A few onlookers clapped out of the corners of their jackets. More cursed. The rebels stared forward and counted faces, because memory was all they could collect. The city smoldered. The river kept moving. The courts-martial began at once under martial law and moved like a metronome. Kilmainham jail took dawn as a habit. Patrick Pierce, Thomas McDonough, Joseph Plunkett, Willie Pierce, Thomas Clark, Sion MacDiarmada, Eamon Siant. Names that had been muttered as curses on Saturday were spoken as prayers by Thursday. Connolly, too broken to stand, was strapped to a chair and shot. The rumor became a picture, and the picture traveled faster than any broadsheet. Roger Casement would hang later, and that rope tightened not only a throat, but British credit in Irish kitchens. Internment gathered the rest. Frongach in Wales picked up the nickname University of Revolution, because men entered as volunteers and left as officers of a struggle not yet scheduled. If the street fighting had been a failed gamble, the aftermath was a printing press. Photographs of ruins taught patience. Funerals wrote editorials. Letters home fixed the sentence that had been read on the GPO steps. Cartridge cases turned into pocket charms. Proclamations hid between the pages of prayer books. Ballads found the city's new key and carried it to farms and emigrant rooms and barracks canteens. Within 3 years, men who had crouched behind biscuit crates would command battalions. Within 5, the capital that had been shelled by its rulers would be the capital of a country that called those rulers foreign. Walk O'Connell Street now and run your fingers over stone pitted by ricochets and bad aim. See the trams in your mind, frozen at angles that look wrong to the eye. Hear the Vickers guns stuttering in the stubborn reply of a handful of rifles. Imagine the Helga's shells curving in from the river. Remember a proclamation read to shoppers became a catechism in schoolrooms and a warrant for history. Cities do not choose the days that make them, but they recognize the days afterward. Dublin did. The Easter Rising failed as a battle and won as a story, and the story, repeated by enough throats, made a nation that had been there all along begin to speak in its own voice. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.